Hello again. I just posted 3 videos on the Quran and the claim of Muslim apologists that the Quran is miraculous because it predicts modern science, and immediately Muslims they challenged me to confirm my claim, asking where this source is that Muhammad supposedly plagiarized. You see, Muslim apologists claim that Muhammad grew up in a very isolated, very backward society, and that he had no access to the scientific knowledge of his time and era. Yet he managed to provide us with a miraculous book that even predicts modern scientific discovery. However, what now? Did you ever consider that this supposed miraculous scientific prediction actually provides us with nothing scientific at all and nothing new or modern at all? Secondly, that this information was common and flourished already before Muhammad's era. And thirdly, and which consequently boils down to the conclusion that maybe Mecca and maybe Muhammad's social circle was not as isolated and backward as Muslim apologists want us to believe. You see, nobody claims that Muhammad or the author of the Quran sat down and actually plagiarized from Greek writings such as Aristotle or Plato. That's the most common Muslim counter-argument against what I'm proposing now. What we propose is that the author simply used the ideas that reached him and his society. We know they did because concepts like the separation of heaven and earth and the concepts of 7 earths or planets and embryology were common ideas in Muhammad's era and time. So were these ideas divinely inspired? Probably not, if you're honest, since they contain gross errors like talking ants and stars being thrown into our atmosphere. These are very much human ideas, but the question is where they come from. How did Muhammad or the author of the Quran get access to this information if he was living as isolated as these Muslim apologists claim he did? Now, one obvious possibility is the interaction between North Arabia and its neighbors. North Arabia was located between a number of highly advanced cultures. Some were closer, some were nearer, like Southern Arabia, the Byzantine Empire, Syria, and also Persia. One of these, the Sabaeans in the South Arabia or in Yemen, was a fairly advanced society in which its people primarily dwelt in cities, in contrast to the nomad life in the north. Now, they influenced the north in various ways, one being the trade routes in which they established intermediate centers or stations, one of these being Mecca. But in the 450s something happens. There is a decline in power in the south. Its proliferation vanishes, which causes massive migration to the north. And according to Dunlop in his book Arab Civilization to AD 1500, these migrants, they strengthened the oasis in the north and their communities, and they probably established intellectual centers among the desert people as well. One more source would be the neighbors in the north of Arabia, Syria, and an incredible advanced society where a lot of interaction went on with the Arabs, both culturally and also politically, even prior to Islam. And we know that the Syrian society had incredible influence on the world in Muhammad's time and before Muhammad's time, even to the extent to impact Jundaspura in Persia, the intellectual center of the time in the world. Also, the influence of Christianity upon North Arabia was similarly remarkable. For example, Christian historians reached deep into the Arabian deserts as far as locations near Medina. Similarly, other Christian groups in the same way. These groups were closely related to Syria and like in Syria, they propagated not only the Christian faith but also Greek science and Greek philosophy. These went usually hand in hand. Neither was their knowledge in Syria confined to the monasteries as elsewhere in the Christian world, but they were transmitted to the people and the community as well. Hence, knowing or associating with a Nestorian or a Syrian Christians, you might have good access to this information. We know that the Syriac language from Syria, affected the Quran a whole deal, since we find a lot of Syriac religious vocabulary in the Quran. And if you're to take Arthur Jeffrey seriously, such words as the Quran, Isa, Injil are originally not Arabic, they're Syriac, which suggests both interaction and also borrowing. Furthermore, we know, for example, that the Syriac had philosophical heroes. One was Galen, the father of ancient embryology, which is fascinating when we think of the whole idea of Muslim apologists and the focus on embryology in the Quran. And there are others. I'm thinking about these Muslims who settled in Abyssinia in the early days of Islam. Again, a fairly advanced culture, at least in reading and writing and education. And then returned back to Arabia, back to the early Muslims, and back to Muhammad, and possibly brought along with them information. This whole idea of runaway Ethiopian slaves, also an issue dealt with in the Quran. The suspicion that Muhammad learned from these. We don't know if that's a fact. However, these came from a quite advanced society, at least again in education and learning and information. Could they have brought information to Muhammad? The possibility is there. At least Bukhari does inform us of one Christian who embraced Islam and who even used to write down the revelations of Muhammad, and he later left Islam and spread this news. He said, Muhammad knows nothing but what I have written for him. And Bukhari informs us that Allah caused this man to die, and after his burial the earth kept spitting him out. Now, if the guy was linked to Syria Christianity, he would be able to provide Muhammad with all these ideas of the Greeks. Who knows? Maybe Muhammad wrote down what this man had informed him about. One more source would be Waraka. Now, who was Waraka? Waraka was in family with Khadija, Muhammad's first wife. In Sahih al-Bukhari we read, Waraka was the son of her paternal uncle, the father's brother, who during the pre-Islamic period became a Christian and used to write Arabic writing. He used to write of the Gospels in Arabic as much as Allah wished him to write. So he was educated. Then we read, but after a few days Waraka died, and the divine inspiration was also opposed for a while, and the prophet became so sad, as we have heard, that he intended several times to throw himself from the tops of high mountains. And every time he went up the top of a mountain, in order to throw himself down, Gabriel would appear, and actually Gabriel would stop him from killing himself. Now, why did inspiration pause, and why would Muhammad attempt to kill himself after the death of Waraka? I heard some Muslims say that Muhammad only met Waraka twice, but I don't buy it. The guy dies, relation pauses, Muhammad is heartbroken, wants to commit suicide, only the angel Gabriel can stop him, and they only met twice. I will say the reaction of Muhammad tells a very different story. Anyway, Muhammad appears to have married into a very rich, advanced, sophisticated and educated family. And at least they were dealing with literature, writings and even translation. So are we correct to describe Muhammad as someone who lacked information, who had no access to these ideas, who was backward and isolated? I would say not really. Muhammad is supposed to have said, and I quote here Qadir in his book Philosophy and Science in the Islamic World, he says, a man's glance at knowledge for an hour is better for him than prayer for 60 years. Then Qadir continues, he says, he therefore commanded all believers to seek knowledge and to go to China in search of knowledge if required. Certainly Muhammad possessed insight into the celestial world and their orbits, at least how they perceived it in his era. Al-Dabari writes, and this is supposedly Muhammad speaking, he says, the Prophet Muhammad replied, Ali, there are 5 stars, Jupiter, Saturn, Mercury, Mars and Venus. These 5 stars rise and run like the sun and the moon in a race with them together. Again, that sounds very much like the Greek concept of 7 planets, which included the sun and moon, which were orbiting around the earth. Interestingly, even the Quran speaks about 7 earths. And there's more. How about the Jewish influence? We do find stuff in the Quran which certainly, definitely comes from the Jewish Talmud. In Medina, Muhammad met the Jews. Again, very sophisticated, very learned and advanced culture. And we know of one convert, at least Jewish, the Jewish convert to Islam, Abdullah ibn Salim, who lived in Medina and was a companion of Muhammad. And Qadir, he points out that Salim was acquainted with cosmology and even spread his knowledge among the Muslims. Interestingly. So, to conclude, it seems that Muhammad was probably influenced, even in Mecca, from several sources, from Medina, possibly from several sources. Would he have access to these ideas? Certainly he would. What we do know is that the science of the Quran is not miraculous. It contains gross errors. We do know where it comes from. It comes from the Greeks. It comes from from some Christian sources. It comes from Jewish sources. It would come from his own family-in-law, and so on. So we know where it comes from, and we know he had the access to this information. So we know there was a source behind, a human source, not a divine source. That's why I would suggest that the Quran is not divinely inspired. It was influenced by humans, by human sources that eventually somehow were brought to Muhammad. So I will end here. May God bless you, and bye for now.